I want to invite folks to tap questions into either the Q&A or the chat. Here's one from Rhonda Tawil. Could you speak more about how the family now relates to their Arabness?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think what is really interesting, it varies. I don't think the family, obviously, and this is stating the obvious. Somebody like Philip, I don't think he would call himself an Arab or relate to it. Uh, he, he relates to the food, Lebanese food. So I mean, whenever food comes up, they immediately get very animated and they begin to talk about the recipes and they carry on. And Philip himself continues to cook. But I don't think he situates himself within a larger rubric of Arab American or even Arabness. And we asked them all if they have traveled back to Lebanon. They all said no, and Philip said he has no interest. On the other hand, the cousins from Valdosta, Georgia, the two women who were at the cemetery with Sandy, they both, there was almost like a moment of awakening in which they said, it just two levels. One is both of them voiced to us their real sadness that they didn't learn Arabic. I mean, they heard it a little bit, especially cursing around the house, but they really kind of feel like they missed the boat on that, these two women. They're in their 50s, 60s. And two, I think they understood their racialization all of a sudden. One of them happens to have, darker skin like myself. And she said, now I feel like I get it, because I always kept wondering, why in the world am I being treated so different? And she's not the same age, obviously, as Emily. And she grew up in the 50s and 60s or so, or 60s and 70s, I guess. And I think the film but more than the film, really, the process of the conversations we had, I think she came to the realization and understanding of her racialization as the other because of her skin. And I think in that sense, that is her connection to it as well. And I think the film, for others, they are beginning to understand that they're connected to a larger world. And again, I go back to this notion of when we brought up the village, pictures of the village, because we have some 19th century pictures from there, the letters. And all of a sudden, I think you begin to see in their conversation them weaving, a reconnecting to those elements.
Mm-hmm. I have a question about process. I mean, I'm sure that the time you spent with them sitting around the table talking must have been terrifically important, just to building the rapport with them and gaining their trust and all. But there's some really brave kind of filmmaking moves here. I'm thinking in particular of some of the really emotional interviews and the choice to, it's just like very patient filmmaking, just kind of letting the camera linger over someone who's really struggling with something is not an easy thing to do. So can you just talk a little bit about the crew, like who was in the room for these interviews and how did that work?
Usually there were four of us. Josh Saby is the main filmmaker. Zach Ciotti was second camera and also helped a little bit with the editing, but Josh did most of the editing. Margie Stevens, who is a senior researcher in the center, and myself. But look, I have to say that the credit goes to Sandy and Stuart Jardina. Sandy Ryland, Stuart Jardina. They both were very open. You've made documentary films yourself, Matt. And people are different. Sometimes they feel comfortable with the camera. Sandy is a natural, and so is Stuart. They both are easygoing. They wanted to do this. They spoke to it, very emotionally, as you saw. And so in many ways, it wasn't really hard for us in that moment to let it roll. But I have to say the credit does go to somebody like Josh, whose sensibility was to let the camera roll, as you said. In other words, given my own limited experience with filmmaking, I perhaps would have maybe shut things down a little earlier. He actually just kind of let it go. And what I mean by that, he had the camera on Sandy all the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, they were driving together in the car, they were walking. The camera was almost always on. And I think in some ways, it's almost like any kind of relationship. This idea of quality time is nonsense. You have to do a lot of time to get those few moments in which somebody just all of a sudden opens up. And I think probably to me, one of the most powerful moments wasn't so much in the hotel when she was reading, but when we went into the Valdosta, Georgia Historical Society Archive Museum. And what is really interesting is that the people there, who were very nice, wanted nothing to do with talking about the KKK. I mean, what they wanted to really do is a post-racial history in which everybody got along well, and how much they liked the Lebanese in the town, and they point to their successes, financial and otherwise, as indication that everybody gets along just fine. And so that was kind of the narrative coming out of that, and they were very uncomfortable when we posed question about something else. Sandy, to her credit, kind of eased that tension. I mean, by basically just being very kind to them and talking about them. And then I think the moment when she opened up the city directory and she saw their names and said, yes, that's them, right? I mean, there was, to her, there was this moment of reality that, you know, her search for the truth is coming together at that moment. And I found that to be very moving. And that's, you know, again, the camera was constantly rolling at that point.
Right. This hadn't occurred to me before, but what was the actual span of the work on the film?
So we released the film in February. That was the first screening that we ever did. But we worked on the film from April 20. So the film was released February 2019, which is last February, about 9 months ago now. But we worked on the film from April 2018 till December 2018.
Right. So you started in the Trump years already.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, like, now that you have a minute to kind of breathe and look back a couple of years, how important is that to the story that you told and the story that you wanted to tell? Like, how different might it have been if you had done this in, 2012?
I'm not quite sure how it would have been different, perhaps, but I do have to say the motivation that I talked about, which is to what a lot of us working in the field of Arab American history are trying to do, is to weave these previously marginalized stories into the mainstream story. It was definitely the motivation was much stronger, seeing what we were seeing in terms of immigration. I mean, I think what was eerie about the whole process is that what was going on in 1920s with the rise of nativism and KKK and anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-immigrant violence, of course, in addition to anti-Black violence, all of that seemed to just be happening 100 years almost later. I mean, it just was bizarre. Almost the same arguments that were being presented by nativists in 1920 are being rehashed by the likes of Stephen Miller. And so there was an urgency.
Yeah.
And I think that was a huge impetus for me, because I felt like this story was so powerful to tell that it had, to be told and to be integrated. And partly, look, I mean, the other thing is, because, again, and I refer back to your arguments about what happens to various ethnic groups and how they become integrated and become white, I think there is a tension within the Arab American community itself, and a debate and an argument about where they fit within the racial spectrum. I served on the United States Census Bureau Advisory Board for about 5 years, at the point where we were trying to bring together, to try to argue for a new category called Middle East and North African, as opposed to white. Because a lot of, especially the younger generation, but most recent Arab immigrants, really don't see themselves fitting as white at all, right, for a variety of reasons, obviously. But what is really interesting is I got as much emails and letters and personal contacts from people who said, no, we want to be white, as many as who said, no, we want the MENA thing. And what is interesting is, I can tell you the categories of what has to remain white. Generally speaking, it was primarily people who are, I would say, third or fourth generation descendants, but also who tend to be on the Lebanese Christian side. I mean, they tended to be very argue very much for that notion. But the point is of all of this is that this argument, about part of it is predicated on the idea that somehow the Lebanese or any other group are escaped the fate of every other immigrant group, that somehow they all succeeded and they just smoothly glided in. And I think that elicits both lack of sympathy to more recent immigrants, dangerous lack of empathy and sympathy, I would argue, even to the point where you have enough of these folks that are voting for somebody like Trump and his policies. But at the same time, it's ignoring their own story and narrative. And so I think that for us was another motivating force in terms of telling that story, saying, look, this is, Arab Americans, and again, several scholars have pointed this out, are in a liminal state of being. On one hand, legally they're white, but in many other ways, they're never allowed to be part of the body politic of America.
Right. I'm just curious. I was brought in as a consultant at the Census Bureau around 2000, and it was when they were debating whether there should be multiracial categories or what the options should be to be able to check more than one box. Right. That was the question they were wrestling with. My experience was I was immensely impressed and pretty surprised at some of the people who work inside the Census Bureau. Was that your experience as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I actually was blown away. First of all, I was blown away by how big the Census Bureau is, but also the amazing amount of data and information they provide and how vital and critical they are to the process. But the professionals there were remarkable. I mean, they were absolutely remarkable. They were thoughtful. They really thought about a lot of different things, and they were learned. And if they didn't know something, they went out and read. They didn't kind of do the lazy way in which they wanted you to give them small sound bites or bullet points. It was really a pleasure to work with all of them. Obviously, as you very well know from your years as advisor, that's not where the problem is.
Right.
The problem is the minute you step outside that edifice, and then you hit Congress and the OMB, and it's ridiculous categories. And so, I mean, they were very conscious of the myriad of identities people have and how you have to take all that and squeeze it into 5 categories of race, which made no sense whatsoever. So I think the tension in that was very understood by them. But yeah, it was a positive experience. And, we came very close to including on the US Census in 2020, but unfortunately the Trump administration came in and the first thing they did is they stopped that.
Right. Right.
So it was a bit of frustrating experience.
We're down to just our last couple of minutes. People, please feel free to throw in a couple more questions if you want. Here's one. It's a pretty straight ahead factual question about the children after the murders. Who took care of them and how were they taken care of?
Sure. So right after the murder, shooting of Hasna and killing her, and then the lynching of Ula. The next day, Aysar, the oldest son, was still in jail. So the first concern was to get him out of jail, and relatives, in a distant sense, in Valdosta. And Valdosta is not too far from Lake City. I would say it's about an hour and a half drive, maybe 2 hours, depending upon how fast you drive. And they immediately telegrammed the governor of Florida, telling him that this kid is in danger. They just lynched his father, and immediately they got him out of jail and took him. The family. So there were only 2 families, Arab American families in Lake City, the Romey family and the Moses family. And the Moses family already had 8 kids. There was another tragedy, and somebody had died, and then those kids came into the Moses family, and then of course now you have 4 kids from the Rumis. So they took all 12 kids and they moved to Alabama within about a week of all of this, because the situation in Lake City was so tense and untenable. And they went to Alabama, and the Moses family stayed there. Aysar at the time was about 17. And then you have Emmeline, Cecile, and Layla. And they lived there, I think, about a year. The Moses family comes back to Lake City, and they stay there. But Aysar and his sisters, they stay in Alabama. And Emmeline and Cecile, I think, are the only 2 who get married. Or Layla, maybe. No, Cecile. Layla and Aysar don't get married at all. And they remain in Alabama for the remainder of their time. Aysar leads a very interesting life. I think he liked to gamble a bit, and he liked to drink, and there were all sorts of reports about his life. But he tried to take care of his siblings as much as he could. Emmeline was traumatized, and again, the diary that Sarah helped transcribe, and that we're actually working with the family to see about uh, publishing it possibly. It's a traumatized one. I mean, it's a very powerful diary, because she's writing it in the 60s, and it just, you can see the pain that she's living with, because she feels like, and I think all of them, to a certain extent, Stewart said it very well, is they felt like there was no justice,
Yes.
right? I mean, they were living with no justice, that their lives was, in essence, worth nothing, their parents' lives in that regard. And so I think there was serious trauma involved with it, from what I understand. Now, I also remember that when I was talking to the family's members in Valdosta, they also talked about them, coming together and reunions and so on and so forth. And there was still joy as a family. But I think the trauma was very real.
Yeah. Yeah. This has just been such a great conversation, great film, an important experience for us. I just want to thank you. I also just want to make sure, I mean, we've ranged across a lot of territory. Is there anything crucial that we should have touched on that we haven't?
No. I think it's the conversation was fine. And for folks who want to, if you go to our website, I'm just going to put the website right up here real quick, because there's a lot more. Let me use that. So if you go to the website, just scroll down a little bit, you'll see a link to the whole story, and there you will find the booklet. And I think the booklet is a little bit, well, not a little bit, a lot more detailed, as well as the archive, and we have the full archive there. So if you ever feel like you want to use it in a classroom or environment, you can use all that material in there.
Great. Well, congratulations on the film. Thank you
so much.
Thank
you,
and thank you for your time tonight. It's really
Thank you so much, and thank everybody for being here tonight.
Yeah.
Be
Thanks,
well.
everyone. See you soon. And Akram, one day I would love it if you and I were in the same room at the same time. That would be.
I'm sure. I look forward to that. Thanks.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.